de Beatmeet. En naast me iemand die boeken heeft geschreven over de Beatles, maar ook heel veel over kan vertellen. Hij houdt hem al omhoog, de Fab 104, en hij gaat er vast over vertellen. Dames en heren, David Bedford.
Thank you, it's lovely here. I will try and speak nice and slowly, because in Liverpool we talk very fast and it's very hard for people to understand, so you don't know what the heck I'm talking about. I will talk slowly.
Better.
That's what we do in Liverpool, I'm afraid. Also, when we get excited, the howling. So here's a tip. If you want to know how to shut up a girl from Liverpool, put her hands behind her back. She can't talk. If you come out to where I am, I'm with my wife Alex, the hands will be going like this. So we talk fast and we talk with our hands. So I'll try and speak slowly for you. So thank you, it is lovely to be here. Beautiful country, beautiful town. It's my very first time in Holland. So thank you all for making me feel very welcome as well. I appreciate it. We will be back. That's a threat, as well as a promise.
Sure.
Now, if you find you can't understand what I'm saying, don't throw things at me first. Just sort of indicating I have my translator next to me. A little bit about the book and why I'm here. In the latest couple of reviews, you may have heard of Mark Lewis, just done his fantastic new book, Tune In. I was with him in August, and that's what he came up and he said to me about the Fab 104, fantastic book with genuinely original research, which is very kind because I found some things out which he didn't, and he's such a nice man. He wasn't jealous at all. He just said congratulations. He was very kind. So books sort of complement each other. Same time period up to the end of 1962. Eddie Deason is a friend of mine. Anybody know the film? It came out in the 1970s. Well, he was an actor in that. He's a Beatle nut. Bill Harry, you know, who Fancy Beat, he's written the foreword to this book for me. Said it proved to be a work no Beatles fan should be without, which was very kind. Rod Davis from the Quarrymen, been very, very helpful with both of my books, for Liverpool, the first one, and Fab 104. He sort of acts as the historian for the Quarrymen, so he's great. So Liverpool was the first book, which is this in 2009. Now this is the first edition hardback. We thought they'd all sold out, but we found copies in our warehouse. We have 2 left. So if anybody likes first edition books, I have them both with me. But this is the first one in hardback, then came into softback. After that we got the softback there as well. And that one's almost sold out as well. Copies left of that. So that's where it sort of started. I spent 9 years researching and writing Liverpool Beatles book, which is just about Liverpool. In there was a chapter which I called The Story of the Fab 27. The musicians in the Quarrymen to the Beatles. There was so much interest in that I started work on this. So the Fab basic in here became the Fab 104. And the 104 is the 104 people in the musical Beatles. And if you want to understand the Fab 4, you need to know about the Fab 104. Every has an important part to play in the story. So that was the chart that I did in Liverpool, and just different musicians and the different group names. And that's expanded into the new book. This is where the story started. Embarrassing photos of me. So that's me with the guitar in the centre there. And I started learning to play guitar when I was about 10. The guy on the far left, we've been friends since we were, bless you, since we were 5 years old. He lived in Madrid Street where Ringo was born. So that's the area where I was, where I grew up as well, in the Dingle. We still play guitar together. And the guy inside, that's of the 2 that I'm on the left, and my friend Gary on the right. That's me posing the special effects so you can't in the dark. and even playing the drums in the boys' brigade. But I was thinking back to when I learned to play guitar. Derek and Gary, my two friends who taught me, and I thought, in the story of the Beatles, not just the musicians in the group, but who taught them, who got them going, how did they actually start as musicians, and then become the group, which became for the Beatles. We launched the book in Liverpool, and some of the people I was very grateful. So we got Frida Kelly, was it last year? She was here, wasn't it? Yeah, she's a very good friend, lovely lady. Behind her is Rod Murray. He was the arts college friend of John Lennon and Stuart Sutcliffe. Rod and Stuart shared a room together. Then at the top is Chaz. Chaz played bass guitar with the Beatles. He was the first left-handed bass player in the Beatles, before Paul. Len Gary and Colin Hanton from the Quarrymen. Beatles promoter Sam Leach. And then Johnny Hutchinson, the Beatles. I was in a group called the Big Three. So they're featured in the book. Here's the question you always ask, another Beatles book? Yes. Is the right answer. Well done. I'm so glad you said that. So here's just some questions. You can answer the questions, then you don't need to buy it. If you can't answer the questions, well, you know what you need to do. They should start a skiffle group and lend him a guitar. This guy has never been found before. He's never been interviewed before, and I found him. Who taught Paul to play the guitar? Who gave George guitar lessons in school? Which Beatle was the Cadillacs? And who was Norman Chapman and what did he look like? Can you answer those questions? No? Jolly good. I'll see you at my table out there in a moment. So I found this quote, always intrigued me, from Lennon. He said that I met Paul and said, do you want to join me band? Then George joined and then Ringo joined. We were just a band that made it very, very big. That we were 4 guys. Or were there only 4? I say no. 4 tells you the evolution of the Beatles, and it's the musical evolution. It goes from the beginning of the Quarrymen, 1956, through 1962. The family, the friends, the performers who helped to shape the Beatles. So there's 104 people. And there's over 570 pictures. And quite a lot of them are rare, and a number of them have actually never been seen before as well, in any other book. Interested? Good. Still awake? Good. Yes. So I like to do 4, which is on the front cover. So here you've got John Lennon, Pete Shotton, Eric Griffith, Bill Smith. They're the first 4 members, and that's the group that went on to become the Fab Four. I think you recognise them, don't you? You may have heard of them. The chart in this book, that's just the musicians. So there's over 40 of them. Every time they changed their name, and they went through 68 different group names until they settled on the Beatles. Different spelling, they had Silver Beatles, variations. So each one of those is mentioned during the book as well. You're doing a great job.
Quite hard, really.
Everybody keeping up? You okay? But I also cover an interesting story. How did groups like the Beatles and the other Liverpool groups get the American records? And there's a story called the Cunard Yanks, and they are the Liverpool sailors who went over to America, bought the records and brought them back. But that was only a small part of the story, not the whole story. Because to get to listen to any pop music on the radio, you had to listen to Radio Luxembourg. Radio Luxembourg was sending the pop music into the UK, because the only radio at that time was the BBC. They had they called the program. It was variety music and a bit of jazz, but not pop music. So all of the Beatles and all their friends would tune into Radio Luxembourg to listen to the songs. And to get the song lyrics, they would listen to the radio and write down hearing. So they didn't always get the words right, but it was as good as they could. and it certainly saved them having to buy the record, have enough money. And I mentioned Burton Wood. The photograph at the bottom on the right, Burton Wood, that was in an airport just outside Liverpool. 1942, the United States Air Force took that over, airport during the Second World War. There were about 18,000 servicemen, US, and they were there right through the 60s. So when they had time off, they came into Liverpool. Now, of course, there was segregation between blacks and whites in America, so the air base was the same. So the black men would come into Liverpool to go to the clubs where the black guys were, the Afro-Caribbean community, and the white guys went into Liverpool City. They brought their American records with them. So that's how the groups were picking them up, because John and Paul in particular go to the clubs where the black guys were and would listen to the American songs and trying to get a different songs that they didn't have. So that's an important part of how they get the music, so I do that as a bit of background. Also, the two main schools, which are Quarry Bank, where John Lennon was, and this is where the Quarrymen were formed. And the pictures there, the Quarry, that was the school magazine. On the right hand side, that is a drawing that John did, which appeared in the school magazine. And at the time, JWL, John Winston Lennon. And just below it here is The Tale of Hermit Fred, was a little poem that John wrote in the school magazine. So he was drawing and writing before he was a musician. So the first lineup of the Quarry Lennon, Bill Smith, Pete Shotton, Eric Griffiths, and then quite soon after, Rod Davis joined as well. This is the guy who has changed Beatles history. This is him, the guy wiping his eye in the middle, Jeff Lee. He's the guy who's John. John was always singing, and so he said to John, as you're always singing, why don't you start? And so they started the Quarrymen. It was down to this guy. But also, very importantly, he had a guitar, which he couldn't. So he lent that guitar to John. So the very first guitar that John learned to play on was not the one that his mum bought for him, that his school friend gave to him. When I heard that story and I'd interviewed him, I went to find a quote from John to back that up. And there's two or three, which says the first guitar I learned to play on, I borrowed from a friend at school. So actually he's the guy who started everything. Today, 50 years later, I mean, it's amazing, isn't it? So here's our first Fab Four. So from Bill Smith, a fabulous pair of ears, and they're great. Then Pete Shotton and John, and then Eric. So they're the ones who started the group at Quarry Bank School. Bill Smith has only been interviewed a couple of times. He still lives in Liverpool. Interviewed him and got his story. There's a fascinating tale. Bill was only with the group for a few months. He had a teacher, if you've seen, it's a big wooden crate. So when he quit, he wanted to keep that. Well, Pete Shotton had it in his house, so Bill and took it. So John and Pete decided they were going to take it back. So they broke into Bill's house. And so, terrible boys. Terrible, terrible, shocking. So then look at the musical influences. So obviously we start, as we probably well know, John's mum Julia was a big influence on John. She played banjo and ukulele. She taught John to play. But John would tune his guitar to his mum's banjo. So he only tuned 4 strings on the guitar, and he played banjo chords on it. He couldn't play it like a guitar. So that's how he started. His uncle George was he gave John a harmonica. John couldn't play it. Arthur Pendleton, but never heard of. He lived 2 doors away from John's mum. So Julia sent John to Arthur Pendleton to learn how to play it. Now if you think how important the harmonica was to those first songs, I mean, Love Me Do is distinctive because of. So Arthur Pendleton deserves his place in Beatles history. So that's the idea of how the book developed. Don't they look great? So that's some of the members of the Quarrymen. So at the top you've got Rob Davis, Colin Hanson, he was the drummer, then Ivan Vaughan, then at the bottom you've got Nigel Wally and Len Gary. So all these people get a mention and you see in the story of the group. So musical influences for Paul, of course Jim McCartney, Paul's dad. That's at the top right, Jim in the middle with Paul and his brother Mike. And Jim was a very good musician. He was a jazz musician, was in a group, had Max band. So he was a big influence on Paul. Bottom left hand corner is Jim Gretty. He gave guitar lessons and chords to the Merseybeat musicians because you bought the guitar at Hessie's and you got a free guitar lesson. So he taught most of the local musicians. Bottom right hand corner, that photograph was taken by Paul. This guy is Ian James, a school friend of Paul's. That's the guy who taught Paul how to play guitar. And then he gave lessons to John and to George. So Ian James gave guitar lessons to John, Paul and George. And Paul says on the day that he met John, the song were the songs that he learned with Ian on that guitar. Harold, his dad, I found that lovely picture, top right hand corner. He was a big influence, as was George's mum. Harold couldn't play the guitar, but he had a friend called Len Horton who could. So Harold arranged for George to go and see Len and get his first guitar. Jeff Nugent, that's him in the bottom right hand corner, sadly died 2 weeks ago. He was in a Liverpool group called, very good musician. He grew up with George, so they learned guitar together. And they used to play on the street corner. And their favourite song to play was Raunchy. And that was the song that George played to John. They got John, they got George. So Jeff was important. A guy called Colin Manley, that's him on the right hand side of that picture. He was best guitarist in Liverpool in the 60s. He was at school with George. He gave George guitar lessons. Very, very good guitarist. He was in a group called the Remo 4. If you look them up, you'll see them on YouTube and stuff. Brilliant guitarist. We were having a chat just before. I was telling you there's, you know, of the Shadows. Obviously they were such a big group. Shadows played at the Cavern and the Remo 4 were the support act. And afterwards, Hank Marvin said, the Remo 4 and Colin Manley, and everybody who watched it said Colin Manley was better than Hank Marvin. I complimented it. So the Rebels, this was George's first group, and it was George, his brother Peter, his best mate Arthur Kelly, and a guy called Alan Williams. Not many people have. No, it's not that he was the Beatles' first manager was Williams. This is a different guy. Not many people have come across him. But a friend of mine interviewed him a few years to interview with him as well. They played once, that's all. They were supposed to be a support act at a local club. The main group didn't turn up. Now the Rebels knew 2 or 3 songs at the most. So they played the same 2 or 3 songs over and over and over again. But everybody thought they were brilliant because of what they did. So that was George's first test, playing as a musician in a group. Now, interestingly, part of the research, so you get the idea of what I do as a researcher, we've always been told that George joined in February 1958. But I got a copy of Eric Griffith's Merchant Navy records because Eric was kicked out of the group for George to join. Now Eric got on his first ship in February 1958. He qualified in January 58, so he must have joined up in December 57. Well, if he quit because George joined, George must have joined before the middle of December 1957. So actually, what we've been able to prove is that George Harrison joined the Quarrymen at the beginning of December 1957, not in 1958. That's what I do with my time. It gives me fun. It really does. You may have seen this photograph is the very first colour photograph of the Quarrymen, George, John and Paul. And there's a guy with his half a pint of Guinness, but there was no date for when that photograph was taken. So I managed to find the guy having the glass of Guinness. Again, this is what I do with my time. This was at the wedding reception for Paul's cousin. So I asked this guy, Dennis, I said, well, you were there. Paul's cousin was Dennis's best friend. I said, so what date was the wedding? 1958. I said, I know it's 1958. When in 1958? Can't remember. So in the end, I had to go and try and find a copy of the marriage certificate. So I did a search for Paul's cousin, whose name is Ian Harris, and he married a girl called Jacqueline Gavin. So I went searching, nothing. Nothing in 1957, 58 or 59. So I thought, what do I do next? But then I thought, as he's part of the McCartney family, they take their first name from their father, but don't use it. Because Paul is James Paul McCartney. Mike is Peter Michael McCartney. So I thought, what if Ian isn't his first name? So I looked up, his dad was Harry. So I then looked for Harry Ian Harris. Bingo, there he was. Married Cecilia Jacqueline Gavin. So not even his wife used her first name either. That's why I couldn't find them. So neither of them used their first name. So I managed to find it, copy of the marriage certificate, which shows that photo was taken on the 8th of March 1958. Now in the book, all you will see is 8th of March 1958. But that's how I got to that date. I have no life. But what a wonderful no life to have, I tell you. Look at the legs on them. Aren't they fantastic? That is Rod Murray and Stuart Sutcliffe. And on the right hand side with the beard, that is Rod Murray, as he looks now. They shared a flat in Liverpool. John used to spend a lot of time with them. They were at the art college together. And coming to the end of 1959, beginning of 1960, there was only John, Paul and George in the group. So nobody would book them, because all the other groups had drummers and bass and electric guitars. So they said to Stuart and Rod, if either of you can get a bass guitar, you can join the group. Well, neither of them had the money. So Rod started to make one. So what he's holding in his hand there is what he cut out of wood as he started to make a bass guitar. But then Stuart had a painting in a local competition, and it was bought by a guy called John Moores for about £65. So suddenly he had the money. Now he wanted to spend it on his brushes, paints, canvases, all his art stuff. When John and Paul found out that Stuart had money, they wouldn't let him go until he agreed to buy a bass guitar. They spent a whole evening in the Casbah Club. Stuart was in the corner, John and Paul, buy a bass guitar, all night until Stuart says, okay. So that's how Stuart joins the group. And Rod still has the bass guitar he started to make. He could have been a Beatle. This was a fascinating part of the story in 1960. If you know some of that history, there was the Jacaranda Club, which is where John, Paul, George and Stuart were playing. The main attraction there was the Royal Caribbean Steel Band. I managed to find 2 members of the Royal Caribbean Steel Band and get their story. And that's what they were telling me about these black clubs and the musicians. So these guys, Vinnie Ishmael, Zank Slogie, Odie Taylor, they were black musicians. They were giving guitar lessons to John, Paul and George. They were teaching them different rhythms, like the calypso rhythms, things like that. Songs like Obladi Oblada, you know, that comes out of that community in Liverpool. That's where these songs have their origins. And they were fascinated, as you may well know, with Motown and all the R&B and the blues music from America. but they were picking all these influences up from the Afro-Caribbean community in Liverpool as well. What a great name, Cheniston K. Rowland. It's a fabulous name, isn't it? Well, that's him in the bottom right-hand corner. He was the guy who took these historic photographs. So at the top, this is the audition that the group, now calling themselves the Silver Beatles. This is May 1960. Chen was the guy who took these photos. So that's Johnny Hutchinson, I mentioned before. They had got a new drummer called Tommy Moore, but he was late. So Johnny had to sit in. When you look at the photograph, Johnny Hutchinson's face is, he's not impressed. Because these were a bum group, they were not particularly good. He was in a group called Cass and the Casanovas. They were one of the best groups. So you can see, you know, John, Paul, George and Stu really getting into it. And this was the guy they got, Tommy Moore. So that's a picture of Tommy at the back. And then the photo on the right hand side from 1970. Again, it's a photo that's never been published before. And so Tommy became their drummer in May 1960 as the Silver Beatles. Then other drummers. 1960 was a big year of change for them. So they had Johnny Hutch and a guy called Cliff Roberts. Now this was, called themselves the Silver Beats. So again, a different group name. And they played at a place called Leiden Hall. Now here's a question for you. If you're a drummer in a group and you're going to play a gig, what should you take with you? Drums. Okay. Tommy Moore didn't take his drums. Why? So he turns up with no drums and he says to this guy Cliff Roberts from King Size Taylor and the Dominoes, "Can I borrow your drums?" Not a chance. So Tommy didn't play, so Cliff Roberts sits in with the Silver Beats as their drummer for one night only. So all these people are in the Fab 104. They all got a little bit in the story. This was probably one of the most exciting things I found. Tommy Moore didn't last very long in the group. They spent 2 weeks going around Scotland. There was a car accident. Tommy Moore ended up in hospital. He had concussion, split his lip, damaged his teeth. But the night he was in hospital, they were also due to be playing. So John went to the hospital, grabbed him out of his hospital bed, took him to the concert. If you've got a really bad headache, what instrument don't you want to play? Correct. So with a banging headache, semi-conscious, he's playing the drums, and he said he had some stitches in his lip. John would try and make him laugh to burst the stitches. It's a lovely guy, wasn't he? Big surprise, when they came back to Liverpool, Tommy Moore quit the group. He didn't get on with John, he'd had enough of that. So they found this guy called Norman Chapman, and there's been virtually no information on Norman. He died many years ago. There was only ever one very short interview with him. I managed to find his daughter, and because there's never been any photos of him published anywhere, I've got the only ever published pictures of Norman Chapman. So that's him, many years later. So he joined somewhere around June 1960, and Norman should have gone to Hamburg with the Beatles. But 1 week before they were due to go, he got a brown envelope and a letter from Her Majesty the Queen. He got called up to do national service in the army. And so instead of going to Hamburg as one of the Beatles, he went to Kenya in Africa for 2 years in the army. So with a week to go, they had to get another drummer, and that's where Pete Best comes into the story. So this was Norman, looking quite young, and he actually ended up appearing on a record just with a local Liverpool group. Now, another spelling of the group's name was Beatles with a double E. So the guys met this guy with a fabulous beard, named is Royston Ellis. He was a beat poet, and he was in Liverpool. And of course, John was really into his poetry. And he got on very, very well with Royston. And so Royston said, well, why don't you as a group come down to London? You do the music, I'll do the beat poetry. And he was saying, how do you spell the group's name? They were spelling it with a double E. So Royston said, do you know what? If we're going to do beat poetry, you should change the second E to an A. Now, have you ever heard when John's talked about the man on the flaming pie said, you shall be Beatles with an A? Royston Ellis is the man on the flaming pie because he was at their flat in Gambier Terrace and he was cooking the pie, which he burned. And that's why John says, the man on the flaming pie. Royston Ellis was the guy. He burned the pie in their flat. He said you should be Beatles with an A. And I found a couple of newspaper cuttings from 1960 where Royston Ellis talks about this group, the Beatles, spelled like that, and how he was going to bring them to London. So Norman Chapman is gone. The Anstey Fan at Sun came out a couple of years ago. There was a letter that Paul McCartney wrote because they were looking for a drummer. There's a little advert in the Liverpool Echo. I found the advert. And Paul wrote to this guy saying, you're a drummer, would you like to audition for the group? The letter never made it to whoever that was. So there's somebody out there who could have been the Beatles drummer. So they were in a panic, but the guy they knew was Pete Best. They knew Pete. He had a group called the Blackjacks up at the Casbah. That's Mona Best, Pete's mum. She ran the Casbah Club. It's a fascinating place. You can still go there now. It's like going back in time. It was open from 1959 to 1962 only. The full story of that is in the book of Liverpool. I'll tell you more about Mona in both books. The right hand side, that's when the Blackjacks reformed a few years ago. So Chas Newby, I mentioned before, Bill Barlow, Ken Brown and Pete Best. That is outside the Casbah Club. So 1961, other people who make it into the Fab 104, these are people who played on stage with them. So you've got Derry and the Seniors up here. They were the first Merseybeat group to go to Hamburg. Now Howie Casey's the guy on the saxophone, and I interviewed him, and he's the guy who famously said when Alan Williams told him he was going to send the Silver Beatles out to Hamburg, Howie Casey said, don't send them, they're a bum group, they're going to wreck it for everybody. That's how good they were. But of course, Alan was managing the Silver Beatles, so he sent them out there. And of course they improved so much, and poor Howie has never lived that quote down. Interestingly, in the 1970s, he played saxophone in Wings with Paul McCartney. He probably still hasn't forgotten what he said. They also split the group, Derry and the Seniors and the Beatles. They mixed up, so Stuart Sutcliffe joined a group with Howie in it. So Howie Casey can confirm that Stuart Sutcliffe was a good rock and roll bass player. There's lots of stories saying that Stuart couldn't play. That's not true. At the beginning he couldn't, but he took lessons and he learned. And Howie said he would never have lasted if he couldn't play. Top right hand corner, Rory Stone, the Hurricanes, with some strange bearded drummer. Ringo something, never heard of him. Because they were out, and that's where John, Paul and George first met Ringo. And that's where they got to know each other and they became friends. That's back in 1960, 2 years before Ringo joined the group. Other people who played on stage with them, Steve Calrow. Ever heard of Steve Calrow? He was the lead singer with the Beatles, one night only. The Beatles had been touring and John had virtually no voice. So Steve had just been singing in the cavern. So they grabbed him and said, right, you're singing with the Beatles tonight. So for one night only, Steve Calrow and the Beatles. The guy in the middle, Buddy Britton, obviously did a Buddy Holly tribute act. The Beatles backed him on stage in Hamburg, as they did for this lady Tanya Day, bottom right hand corner. So they acted as a backing group to a number of people as well. Tony Sheridan, absolute legend. One of the biggest regrets for the book I was due to interview Tony. The day before we were going to be talking is when he got rushed into hospital. And of course didn't come out and he died. So I'd spoken to him in Liverpool and we chatted and we set up the interview. But literally the day before is when he got taken really ill. Went to hospital, didn't survive. Such an important part in the story. They called him the teacher. As well as these books, I've got a book on my table, I've got a couple of copies written by a school friend of Tony, and they stayed friends, and he's written just a short book about Tony called The Teacher, with Tony's help. He finished the book just after Tony died. A fascinating story. Other people they backed, Cilla Black. There's just been a documentary on drama on British television about her. Johnny Gustafson, he was in the Big Three. Again, sadly, he's just died a month ago from cancer. What's Right Hand Corner is the David Lewis Theatre, where the Beatles fan club in Liverpool were meeting, and all the equipment broke down, so Paul and Pete Best just did some songs for all the fans. Just another fun day. This is one concert I would love to have been at. October 1961. For one night only, Jerry and the Pacemakers, plus the Beatles, plus a singer called Carl Terry, on the stage at the same time, calling themselves the Beatmakers. What a lineup. Wouldn't have minded seeing that one. This photograph is from Hume Hall, and that's where Ringo made his debut. Now unfortunately there's no photos of Ringo's first appearance, but that's what the stage at Hume Hall looked like. So we get to August 1962. Pete Best has been with the group for 2 years. They've got their record deal. They're about to head off to London very soon, when Pete's summoned into Brian's office and told him, has been told sorry Pete, the boys want you out. Ringo's going to join on Saturday. I discussed various theories in both books. Some obvious ones which you can dismiss, but just some different ideas as to why it would have happened. Pete was never given the full answer. There have been lots and lots of different versions of the story told by all the Beatles, George Martin, and they've even told 2 or 3 different versions of the story themselves. Part of it is an idea just to make sure there's not one story out there, there's lots of different ones. It's a good conspiracy. And even how Ringo joined. So that a lot of people have tried to say, and it's one of the things I have about Mark Lewison's book, and we've discussed this, is he says that it was always going to be Ringo. He was the only drummer that was going to join them. And we know that's not true, because other drummers were asked in Liverpool before Ringo was asked. And then the story of how did he join. Some people say Brian rang him, others that John and Paul drove down to the holiday camp where he's playing with Rory Storm and the Hurricanes. Did George ring him? What I was able to find was an interview that Ringo gave in November 1962, so just after he joined, before they were famous. And he actually tells how he joined, and it was the Saturday before he made his debut. George left a message for him to call him. Ringo rang George. George said, come down to the club, we're playing tonight, it's the Saturday night. So he went down into Liverpool, watched the Beatles play. And then he said, we're going on to the Blue Angel Club. Pete's not coming, you come with us. John, Paul and George took Ringo with them, introduced him to Brian. Brian offered him the job. Pete was brought in a few days later, was sacked. Ringo joined the Saturday after. That's how quick it was. And that's from Ringo. And I say, after that, lots of other stories and different versions of the story. But because that was told at the time, that's why we can believe how accurate that was. And interestingly, Ringo, when he joined, did not join as a full member of the Beatles. He joined on probation, just to see if it would work out. If he would work out, which he did obviously, then he became a proper member of the group. So musical influences, well, One of the most important people is Harry Grave. That was his stepfather. Harry bought him the set of drums, so he got him started. Ringo was in this hospital suffering with tuberculosis. While he was there, he played in that little music group, always wanted to play the drum, and that's why Harry said, when you come out of hospital, I'll buy you a drum kit. He had some lessons from a guy up there called Greg Carter, and that's the first group that he was in over there, the Eddie King skiffle group, who were about the best skiffle group in Liverpool. Then tells the story of when he makes his debut, 18th of August 1962. The young guy in the middle there, his dad organised that night, and his dad said to his son Ian, who should we book for the dance? And he suggested the Beatles. The Cadillacs, again, that interview that Ringo gave in 1962, he talks about being in a group called the Cadillacs. It's the only time it's been mentioned. Still doing some research on it, and I was talking to Ringo's photographer over in LA a couple of weeks ago. He's going to ask Ringo, see if he can find out some more information for me. But Ringo, this is one of the groups that he was in. Who are they? Yeah. I think you know those ones, don't you?
Never seen them.
Never seen them before, no. They had a few records in them. It was a long time ago. So after Ringo joined, there were still a few other musicians, because Ringo then starts recording on the 4th of September 1962. But George Martin didn't like Ringo's drumming. So they had to go back the week after with this guy, Andy White, playing the drums. He played on Love Me Do and P.S. I Love You. And he also recorded a version of Please Please Me with them. Other people they backed: top right hand corner, Simone Jackson, lead singer with the Beatles. 16-year-old, she was going to be the next big star. Never heard of her again. She appeared in Liverpool at the Cavern, and the Beatles backed her. This is a group here who should have made it. A black vocal harmony doo-wop group called The Chants. Again, look them up on YouTube. They were fantastic. So good that they arranged to back them at the Cavern as an audition for Brian, and Brian signed them and promoted them as well. And the Beatles tried to get them famous, and unfortunately, I don't know whether the timing was wrong, but they were a fantastic group. Very, very good. So I've interviewed one of the members of The Chants. And the end of 1962, the guy in the middle, Horst Fascher. Have you ever heard the Live at the Star Club? On stage, Horst and his brother Freddie get up and sing with the Beatles. And that, I think, is 104 people. So maybe John should have said, we were just 104 guys. What do you think? So if there's 104 of them, I think that makes me the 105th people. What do you think? We agree with that one? Jolly good. So there you go. I've got a special offer. If you want to come and buy it, go at €48. I say there's 400 pages in there, over 570 pictures. A lot of them are rare. It tells that whole story of how they became the Fab Four. And if you really want a little competition, I've got written down a brief history of the Beatles called Am I the Walrus? With lots of errors in it. Lots of errors that have been out there from other books and stories. See how many you can spot. So if you want to go with that, just come and see me at the table, take a copy, and see how well you can do. And that's me. So I hope you enjoyed that. That is the 104 of them, the Fab 104. Has anybody got any questions that you would like to ask me? Apart from, can you say that again?
Something about Pete Best, what you tell about Ringo.
Yeah.
But there must have been something wrong between Pete and the other ones. Obviously there was something not good in the relation.
I agree. I think with the Pete Best situation, John, Paul and George, as we've seen here, were together from the end of 1957. They went through about a dozen drummers Because in groups back then, the drummer wasn't important. The Beatles group was about John, Paul and George. Whoever the drummer was, didn't matter. Pete didn't quite fit in with the others. As we know, once Ringo had joined, he did. He fitted in, and he was perfect. And I think he was really the first drummer in the group to be a personality. Because it wasn't the Fab Three, it was the Fab Four. And by sticking him on the podium, his little nodding of the head and everything, Ringo became an important part of the group. But I think, yeah, Ringo fitted in better. And as we see through the book, John, Paul and George played with a lot of musicians before they ended up as the Fab Four. And they were just finding the right combination.
But it was not a very nice thing to do, because they owed a lot to Mona Best.
Yeah, and that is one of the things that Mona and Pete, between them, were managing the Beatles. Mona and Pete did a lot for the group. And just suddenly, they already had the record deal. And George Martin had said he would bring a session drummer in. Pete wouldn't play on the records, but that was quite normal to have session musicians back then. But they decided it was time to get rid. So it was cruel. Yes?
When you wrote, did you approach Paul or Ringo?
No.
Why not?
If you want to do anything official with Apple or Paul and Ringo, they would have complete control over what goes in the book. And I don't want that. The whole point is, I want it to be, as a historian, that I tell you these are the facts, and this is how I see it. Which isn't always how they would want the history to be told. And I think one of the most embarrassing parts for them is replacing Pete with Ringo. And also the fact that Ringo didn't join as a full member, and he wasn't the only drummer. That looks a bit embarrassing now. That's why you hear them saying so many times, Ringo was the greatest, he was the best drummer in Liverpool, we had to go and get him, he was the only one. It wasn't true. In the end, he was the best fit, but they didn't know that when he joined. So then you think, oh, it worked. We better go and change history to make it look a little bit better. Anyone else got a question? Question at the back.
So, Mr. Bedford, you are sure, because Lewison tells us that George Harrison came in the Beatles, I think it was February or March of '58. You are sure that it was already 75?
57.
57?
Yeah, we were able to prove it because we know that because Eric Griffiths was kicked out of the Quarrymen and George replaced him.
Yeah.
From the copy of the Merchant Navy records that we've got, it shows you when he qualified. He qualified for a ship in January 1958.
Yeah.
He joined his first ship somewhere around the 12th or 13th of February 1958. So if he qualified in January, that's a 4-week training.
Yeah.
So he would have signed up for the Merchant Navy middle of December 1957. He only joined the Merchant Navy because he was kicked out of the Quarrymen. So he must have been kicked out before the middle of December. We know it happened at Wilson Hall, and the Quarrymen played Wilson Hall at the beginning of December 1957.
Interesting.
And I talked to Rod Davis from the Quarrymen a lot with that. So we know, and that's the factual one, because we know we can base it on those Merchant Navy records.
This Ringo, I think there were two things replacing Pete Best. Just a bit sounding. Because first he was more subtle. He was more subtle drummer than
Yes.
But I have read in all books, because I do a lot of research as well. It was mainly also a thing about Pete was not so communicated. So Ringo fitted also socially
Yes.
much better with the humor, about John and Paul and etc.
Yeah.
Pete was a very shy guy, and it didn't work.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that ended up being quite a big factor, is that Pete was never fully part of the group. And as Ringo said, he had to join the Beatles first as a drummer, then as a person. And that was important.
Yeah.
And he had that personality which fitted in.
Yeah.
It was also, Pete Best was very good looking at that moment.
Yes.
And I think with Paul, a little bit jealous, he is also
Yeah.
part of it.
And there's also not just Paul being jealous, but Paul's dad, Jim,
Yeah.
was jealous of the attention that Pete was getting because he wanted his son Paul to have the attention. And there was an incident in Manchester, and the Beatles had played, and as they were coming through the stage door to get back on the minibus, whatever they were getting onto, everybody, other fans were trying to grab them. The girls grabbed Pete, the others got back onto the bus. Pete was grabbed, they took bits of his hair, his clothes, he was mobbed. He eventually gets back onto the bus, looking an absolute mess, and Jim McCartney tells him off. Why are you doing that? Trying to grab all the attention for yourself? It's not about you. Now, what could Pete have done? He's in a crowd and they grab him. There's nothing he could do. But Paul's dad told him off. So I think Jim was a little bit jealous that Pete was getting the attention. I think there was one occasion, Bob Wooler, who was like the cavern DJ, he suggested making more of Pete and the group. So he said, bring the drums to the front of the stage. So Pete was at the front with them. It was a disaster because the girls went for Pete and the drums, and Pete came off the stage. So they had to push him towards the back again. So Pete did get a lot of attention. So there was a bit of jealousy there as well.
John was also involved in it. John Lennon was the guy who was the most jealous character, I guess, at that time, wasn't it?
No, I think John didn't matter, so he wasn't that worried about the image and all that. Paul was more worried. He liked being the pretty one. I'm saying that's where I think his dad comes into the story as well. So, right, so
I've got 2 more questions.
you've got 2 more questions. Squeeze them in.
You obviously did a lot of research for your books, but it must have been questions you couldn't get an answer to. What's the most frustrated thing you came across? You can't find the answer, maybe the people here can help you?
What couldn't I find an answer to? I think that the biggest one is what we've just been talking about when Pete was replaced by Ringo, and I really would love the opportunity to talk to George Martin and find out from him, because I think they used the comments from George about Pete's drumming to get rid of him. But George Martin has told the story 3 or 4 different ways, and that's the problem. One of the hardest things as a researcher is you can't just go and listen to one person's story and take it. So you have to listen to and read all the different versions and try and work out what you can prove. Is there something common that they're all saying? Is there a motive for not giving the truth? What can you actually say is factual? So sometimes we have to say, this is as close as we can get it. So that's one thing and Paul is the only person who can honestly tell us why Pete was sacked and why Ringo joined, and he won't say anything. Unless any of you know Paul, can you give him a ring for me?
Let's try.
And my last question, will there be a 3rd book?
No, there'll be a 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th. I'm already working on 3 at the moment, which will keep me busy for the next 2 or 3 years. Bit too early to say anything about them yet. But it's about a group from Liverpool called the Beatles. Yeah. Now, there's one I can tell a little bit about, which is a big honour. I've actually been asked to work on a book with Hunter Davis, and Hunter, of course, did the only official biography of the Beatles. So I'm working on a Beatles book with Hunter at the moment. That probably won't be out until 2016. But that is a big, big honour for me.
Okay, David, thank you very, very much for your entertaining story. This is for you. Een applausje voor Bedford. You're welcome.